Okay, welcome back to Beyond Foundations. My name is Dean VanEvery, associate pastor at Grand Avenue Baptist Church. So this is part two on the discussion of divine simplicity. So you might want to go back and listen to the first one, but don't do that quite yet. Listen to the next minute or so before deciding whether to jump back or not. So this is where I'll really start digging into the doctrine itself. All right. So last time kind of did some basics, some kind of calisthenics before we hit the slopes. So my goal for this episode is just to give you a quick kind of intro to why this doctrine can feel so hard to grasp, and then give a quick high-level summary of the doctrine itself. So again, the first part of this episode is still kind of the safety briefing before we make for the summit, right? Everything about kind of rock climbing. We need to do just a little bit more stretching before we hit the cliff face. So of the four, if you only listen to one episode, this is probably the one to listen to. This is going to be the one that's kind of stand on its own the most helpfully with regard to what simplicity even is and why it's kind of a hot topic. So the first episode was really just kind of a warm up, right? Almost a warning. And then the next two after this one are going to be basically going deeper into the concepts that get introduced here, that I'm going to introduce here. So if you just want a quick summary and some of the key points, this is the episode for you. So if you find yourself listening to this, again, if you find yourself listening to this and this is just kind of nothing but frustrating, nothing but discouraging, feel free to stop listening to this. This is an important doctrine, but it's not necessarily an urgent doctrine. This just isn't an easy thing to grasp right away. So there's no shame in simply saying, man, I'm not in a place right now to try to wrap my head around this. Maybe I'll come back to it later. Maybe. But if you're frustrated, but you really do want to dig in more, but you kind of want to put in more work to understand it, just let me know. Come and talk to me. Come and find me, and we can talk about this more offline. Kind of address your questions a little bit more specifically. Right. I just don't know what gaps you might have, what things I might not be saying clearly. So if you want to dig deeper, just let me know. We can kind of have that conversation in a one-to-one basis. So, why is this such a difficult doctrine to grasp? Again, I recognize I haven't even really defined it yet. I kind of gave a quick definition in the last one. Again, simplicity basically just teaches that God is not composed of any parts. Physical parts, even, conceptual parts, metaphysical, ontological parts, everything that is in God just is God. There's no parts in God. I'll unpack that a lot more in this episode, but then a lot more in the next couple of episodes to come. So I know I haven't even really told you in too much detail what this doctrine is, but I thought it might just be helpful to kind of own up front just that this is not an easy concept, both to grasp and to appreciate, right? To kind of understand why this is a big deal. So this is in kind of theological level of complexity. This is a doctrine right about at the same level as the Trinity. Both simplicity and Trinity address the very nature of God, kind of at his most absolute, at his most kind of abstracted from creation. So trying to kind of comprehensively wrap your mind around simplicity, it really is about as difficult as trying to wrap your mind around Trinity. There are things that God has revealed. There are ways to understand both of these doctrines, Trinity and simplicity, better, but both are at the end of the day incomprehensible. We just can't kind of wrap our creaturely minds around them and say, "Oh, I get it. That makes perfect sense." Right? I'll try to explain a little bit of why that is, kind of really in the next episode. But I just want you to recognize that what you are about to engage with really is no less inherently difficult to grasp than the Trinity. So this is kind of the scale of what we're kind of trying to talk about. So that being said, I actually do think it kind of practically it might even be more difficult to grasp than the doctrine of the Trinity. Not in of itself, but just kind of because of how we approach it. Right? There are basically two reasons why that is. So first, the Trinity is something that you probably have a good bit of familiarity with. Right, you've heard of it, you know about it, you've been told that it's a hard thing to grasp. You kind of know its basic contours, right? One God, three persons, all of that, right? If you've been in church for a while, you've heard those things, and you've probably heard those things multiple times. So add to that, most people that you go and talk to who've also kind of been in church for a while will reinforce this and affirm these basic contours and affirm, yes, this is a complex and difficult thing to understand. So you're somewhat prepared for it, and you're helped simply by the repetition of having heard about it lots of times. But simplicity is not that way, right? If you've been in church your whole life, it's entirely possible that you've never heard of it. You may have, praise God if you have, that's great. But it's entirely possible to have never heard of it, even if you've been in church your whole life. And honestly, for the last kind of 100 or so years, we just haven't been teaching doctrines like simplicity, and this silence has only been amplified in really the last couple of generations with the church growth movement. Right, kind of talked about that last time. So because we've never heard of it, right? We don't even understand the question that simplicity is trying to answer. So then, and because it hasn't been taught in church, frankly, it hasn't been taught to pastors, and because it hasn't been taught to pastors, it hasn't been taught to theologians. So now we end up in a place where the doctrine of simplicity was basically taken as kind of an obvious and non-negotiable doctrine for theologians like Augustine, Anselm, Aquinas, Luther, Calvin, Owen, Edwards, Spurgeon. Right? To them, to deny simplicity was to deny the creator-creature distinction, and it's really to deny God himself. Then now, kind of all of a sudden, it's a controversial doctrine that some theologians feel at leisure to deny altogether. So both simplicity and Trinity are both in themselves incomprehensible. But Trinity, the idea of God being Trinity, is at least familiar and uncontroversial. Everybody agrees on that. If you're a Christian, you agree with that. But simplicity is both unfamiliar and in recent years, controversial. So the first obstacle to understanding simplicity is just its unfamiliarity. But the second obstacle that makes it kind of practically more difficult than the Trinity is the fact that it's a doctrine that requires kind of a robust, systematic thinking. And the Trinity can at least be explained just using kind of biblical texts and terminology straight from the page. So, what do I mean? So basically, there's a difference between biblical theology and systematic theology, right? To be crystal clear, both are really, really good. Both are absolutely necessary for the life of the church, but they just use different vocabulary and operate in different modes of thought and argumentation. So the trouble is, quite frankly, most of what kind of gets called systematic theology in kind of modern conversations just isn't systematic theology. It's biblical theology, and again, biblical theology is really, really good, and it's really important. It's just a different thing. It's like trying to say which is more important, medicine or surgery. They're just different. We need them both. So I would guess that most Christians who are familiar with the distinction, right, who have heard of those terms, biblical theology, systematic theology, would basically define them something along the lines of like, well, biblical theology, on the one hand, kind of addresses individual books within the Bible or individual passages in themselves. But on the other hand, systematic theology kind of addresses a given theme or a given topic across the whole canon of Scripture. Like when you start pulling in verses from different books, all of a sudden now you're doing systematic theology. Right, so the first might ask, what does Isaiah, right, just kind of for instance, say about God's sovereignty over world events, right? Maybe that's biblical theology, but then maybe systematic theology might be asking, what does kind of the Bible taken as a whole say about God's sovereignty over world events? Now again, both of those are really good and helpful, but frankly, both of those are biblical theology. Both of those are firmly within the category of biblical theology, and which is a really good thing. So the way that I would describe the difference between biblical theology and systematic theology basically is all wrapped up in the primary object of study. What is the thing that you are studying? So for biblical theology, the object of study is the Bible, right? What does the Bible say? But then for systematic theology, the object of study is God and God's works. Right, so again, biblical theology and systematic theology are both good and necessary for the life of the church, and they both need each other to be genuinely Christian, right? Systematic theology, focused on God and God's works, kind of untethered from the Bible, ends up basically with pagan philosophy, and then biblical theology, untethered from God, ends up basically with German liberal higher criticism, right? Where you have people that are very well educated in the Bible that don't believe in God. Right. So these are the two pitfalls, right? In the history of biblical theology, you can have kind of the odd phenomenon of these world-class Bible experts who simply don't believe in God. They're genuinely expert in the theology of the Gospel of Luke or the Pentateuch, and, right, and can make genuinely helpful insights for Christian application of the text. But they just don't believe it's true. It's just kind of a relativistic study of an ancient text. But then on the other hand, right, in the history of systematic theology, you can have kind of this odd phenomenon of these world-class theology experts who just won't yield to the authority of the Bible, right? So the biblical theologian, for instance, needs to be well-versed in the methods and assumptions of text criticism so that he can properly appropriate their genuine insights and properly combat their excesses and errors, right? The ways that their kind of atheistic assumptions lead them off base. But then the systematic theologian needs to be well versed in the methods and assumptions of the various schools of philosophy so that he can properly appropriate their genuine insights and properly combat their excesses and errors, right? The ways that their humanistic and rationalistic assumptions lead them off base. So biblical theology is focused on the text. What does this text say? The danger there is a relativism that doesn't connect the text, frankly, to other texts in the Bible or even just to the real world, right? If we do biblical theology with the question of God kind of bracketed off for a later discussion that never comes, we kind of end up in this relativism. Oh, John says this, but maybe Isaiah says something totally contradictory, and whether or not that's either irrelevant is a totally different question. But systematic theology aims to integrate what's basically called special revelation, basically the Bible, with general revelation, nature, history, conscience. So trying to do systematic and general, special and general revelation. So systematic theology enters into conversations basically that pagan philosophers and other religions have been having for thousands of years. The danger here is basically that a humanistic rationalism that refuses to acknowledge the authority of the Bible and refuses to acknowledge the limits of human reasoning. So kind of in the ideal world, biblical theologians and systematic theologians are standing back to back, kind of resourcing and defending each other, while at the same time fighting off the onslaughts of the kind of atheistic relativists on the one side, right, kind of the biblical theologian's opponent, and the rationalistic humanists on the other, kind of the systematic theologian's opponent. Right. So it's basically all that to say, you need systematic theology to get the doctrine of the Trinity. But having arrived there, having gotten to the doctrine of the Trinity, you can explain it, you can expound it, you can tell it to other people in a very straightforward way, just from expositing texts in the Bible. Look at John 1, look at John 5, look at Matthew 28, look at Colossians 1, look at Philippians 2, right? Then you can just kind of explain the text and just show how the doctrine of the Trinity can be seen just emerging from the text of Scripture itself. But simplicity is not quite that easy, right? It's a doctrine that emerges kind of more explicitly from conversations in general revelation. David says that the heavens proclaim the glory of God, Psalm 19. Paul says that God's divine nature and eternal power, that God has made this evident to pagans because God has revealed it, right? As Romans 1, right? So it's not just kind of there. That's why it's called general revelation. God has so designed the world and the human mind such that truths about God are revealed to the rational creature. So, right, there are texts that we can point to, right? Genesis 1, Exodus 3, Deuteronomy 6, John 1, Hebrews 1, but none of them really are just kind of simple expositions of God's kind of ontological relation to creation. So, John 5 is this explicit exposition of the Son's relation to the Father. It's not easy to understand, but it's right there in the text. If you get that text right, you get a good chunk of the kind of contours of the doctrine of the Trinity. But there just aren't any texts like that for simplicity kind of in and of itself. So this doctrine is hard because it just kind of requires a certain way of doing theology that we just aren't well practiced in, kind of broadly speaking. So that being said, I want to give you just a quick high-level summary of where this doctrine comes from, what it is, and kind of a little bit of why it's important. So What I'm going to do next is basically kind of the high level summary of everything that's going to follow. So if you're listening to this later, the next episodes later on, and you're kind of confused about something that I'm saying, circle back here, re-listen to kind of here to the end of this episode. It might clear things up a little bit, right? It might not. I don't know. But it might help. This is kind of the summary. This is the big picture. This is what I'm trying to get at. Right. And also, again, if you find yourself just lost later on or just frustrated, just kind of, maybe circle back to this, put this part in your pocket, this high level summary, and kind of move on. That's totally fine. Again, this is important. This is beautiful, but it doesn't have the urgency that some other doctrines might have. So don't feel like you need to master this quickly all at once. At its most simple, the doctrine of divine simplicity simply teaches that God is not composed of any kind of parts. No parts, no composition. So now immediately you probably think that just kind of means physical parts, right? Like he doesn't have limbs, doesn't have a head, doesn't have a torso. That's all true. But obviously that's not a very interesting doctrine. God is spirit. John 4 teaches that God doesn't have a physical body. So God doesn't have physical parts. Yes and amen. But beyond that, simplicity also teaches that God doesn't have any conceptual or ontological or metaphysical parts. So this doctrine, simplicity, really should control how we think about God's attributes in general. In us, our attributes they're all really different things that are more or less kind of summed up and added together to create us as individuals. Right. So maybe you might be male, maybe you're short, maybe you're in good shape, maybe you're smart, maybe you're a little bit lazy sometimes. Well, maybe you're kind, but sometimes maybe you're a bit short-tempered. Maybe you're mostly merciful, but sometimes maybe you're easily fooled, right? Whatever, kind of your attributes, everything from, what you look like, how you behave, personality, concepts that describe you. Those are your attributes. So for us, those are all really distinct things. Your maleness is really distinct from your mercifulness. But for God, all of his attributes are just different ways of looking at his indivisible Godness. Again, for you, your mercifulness and your short-temperedness, right, since they are really distinct, will often be in tension with each other, pushing and pulling to see which one gets expressed. Are you going to be merciful here, or are you going to be short-tempered here, right? Both are true of you, but they're kind of in conflict with each other. But for God, since his justice, his love, his goodness, and his mercy are all really just his undifferentiated Godness, they are never in tension. His justice always expresses his perfect mercy. His love always expresses his perfect goodness. So I'll explain this a little bit more in kind of the actual beef of the next couple of episodes. But for us, our attributes are really more basic than us. They are really more simple than us, right? Everything that is made up of parts that isn't purely simple is made up of things that are more basic and more simple than themselves. A good analogy is just to think about kind of physical reality, right? Kind of think back to your high school chemistry and biology, right? So there's this near infinite, just a massive amount, a huge number of living things out there that themselves are made up of a really big but probably smaller number of chemicals, right? So this vast number of different organisms, different types of living things in the world are made up of a finite and quite a bit smaller number of discrete chemicals or organic chemicals. So the different life forms are more complex. They're less basic than the chemicals that make life happen, right? Then, go down another level. So this huge number of organic chemicals that make up life on Earth are themselves only composed of different combinations of really a few hundred elements, right? So the elements, several hundred elements, are more basic and more simple than the thousands and tens of thousands, I have no idea, lots and lots of chemicals made up from those elements that make up all the life forms, right? So you're getting, higher up towards life forms, you get more complex and higher numbers, but the farther down you go from life forms to chemicals to elements, you're getting more simple and fewer. Then you go down another level, right? These few hundred elements, what are they made of? Electrons, protons, neutrons. kind of in various numbers and arrangements, right? So a few hundred elements are made up of 3 atomic components, right? So the complex is composed of the simple, the more basic. So that's kind of in a ontological, not just physical sense. That's basically what I'm getting at here. The more fundamental something is, the more simple it is. The less composed it is. The compound is always made up of things more simple than itself. So if God were really composed of different attributes, kind of summed up to make God God, then he wouldn't be the fundamental reality of the universe, but would himself be a creature. So that's kind of the quick version of what simplicity is, right? God is not composed of parts. He is the most kind of ontologically simple and basic reality in the universe. But that last point, that last bit kind of points towards really where the whole doctrine of simplicity comes from, right? So maybe you're starting to get the idea of what I'm getting at, but where does it come from? Is this a biblical doctrine? So simplicity itself is a derivative of the doctrine of creation ex nihilo. So this is why I led into this topic with a discussion of creation ex nihilo, right? That's again just Latin for out of nothing, right? Creation out of nothing. So here's basically the straightforward argument. Creation out of nothing teaches that God created everything that is not God, right? So take, in your mind 2 categories on either side of a line. On one side there's creator, there's uncreated, and on the other side there's created, right? So on one side there's God and only God, and on the other side there's everything else, right? God is the creator of everything that is not God. So in that is implied the doctrine of simplicity, right? If God created everything that is not God, then God cannot be composed of parts that are more basic than himself, right? Even these real attributes. If God is composed, really composed, of things like justice and mercy and love and power and knowledge as really distinct from his own nature, then creation out of nothing is false. Put another way, if God's attributes are really distinct from him, then he is a creature and something else created God. It might just be that his attributes kind of all happen to congeal into one being, and it might have been in eternity past, but that would just make him the first and eternal creature. So where do we find the doctrine of simplicity in the Bible? Well, really, anywhere that you find the doctrine of creation out of nothing. Again, Genesis 1, John 1, Hebrews 1. So really, that's my quick kind of high-level summary, right? Divine simplicity means that God is not composed of parts, right? Since he is the creator of all that is not God, then he is the most basic, the most fundamental, the most simple being. Or as kind of the ancients would say, he is superlatively simple. A unity beyond our comprehension of unity. So this has implications for how we do theology, how we think about the attributes of God, but it also kind of undergirds a lot of just our comfort as Christians, a lot of our gospel hope. All right, so we know that God's love and God's goodness are not kind of set aside when his wisdom and his will decree a certain difficulty or a certain suffering for us. The simple God always acts in perfect accord with all of his attributes because they're not really distinct in him, but just are him. God's love is him. God's justice is him. God's power is him. God's knowledge is him. God's will is him. So all of God's acts are all of God acting. We know that God will fulfill his promises and won't change his mind because he can't change. Change, interestingly, requires parts. Since God is, again, superlatively simple, there just are no parts of him that could be altered. There's just God. So this doctrine, simplicity, is important, but kind of beyond spelling out kind of the different ways that it matters for us, really the more that you just start to grasp this, the more that you just kind of sit with this idea, the more it'll just start to kind of seep into and color all of your thoughts about God. It'll start to underline, start to bolden just how different God is from us. He is creator. We are creature. Okay. In the coming two parts, I'm going to dig a little bit deeper into simplicity, right? In the next episode, I'm going to try to more or less try to start basically from your own experience of the world, kind of just the world around you, and try to just walk you step by step to understanding basically the general revelation basis for divine simplicity. What's the big idea that we're trying to get at here? Then in the last episode, the fourth one, basically I'll tour through a few kind of historic theologians and see just kind of briefly what they have to say on simplicity and try to add some more detail to just what exactly this doctrine is and what it's trying to communicate about God. So, frankly, for some, this might just be a good place to stop. I mean, the next two episodes might be more confusing than helpful. I'm not really going to say anything substantively more than I already have here. I'm just going to try to dig a bit deeper into these concepts. So, if you want to go deeper, listen to the next couple. But if you feel like this is enough for now, and there's no shame in that, feel free to call it a day. Feel free just to call it quits here. Again, this is going to be the summary. So, maybe go back listen to the last 15 minutes or so to get a refresher on just some of these big ideas. But yeah, hopefully this is helpful. Hopefully this is starting to make sense of why this is a big deal. So anyways, thanks for listening.